VCU students. My name is Renuka Karami, and I attend VCU. And I'm here with Diplomat-in-Residence John Dinkelman today to talk about some career questions about how to join the Department of State or public service. So I'm going to start with a story. I'm going to ask you to tell me a story that has not been told yet that you think it's important for students to know.
Oh, well, Renuka, thank you very much for the opportunity to do this. And I look forward to meeting everybody here on campus who would be interested in joining the Department of State. I think the story that goes untold, repeatedly goes untold, is just how exotic and wonderful a career it can be representing the United States abroad. I've been doing this job for over 36 years, and it never ceases to amaze me, the scope, the breadth, and frankly, even the depth of opportunities that I've been given as I've gone around the world with my wife and children in tow, as we've seen and done things that I think most people wouldn't ever imagine. And the same can be true for each ensuing generation of Foreign Service employee. And this is one of the reasons why I'm here, is to make sure the word gets out.
Wow, that was a great answer. Thank you. I'm going to talk about something that I think we often forget to talk about, and that is, it's not what you know, it's who you know in Washington. So what do you think is the best way for students to learn networking skills and develop relationships outside their university?
That's a great question. Washington, D.C. is largely based on reputation, relation, and understanding of individuals as whole persons and not simply as somebody in that office. Whether it's who you're playing on a volleyball team with, who you're going to church with, or who you worked with many years ago, it's all a case of one building one's reputation and one's personal network. Now, let's face it, the vast majority of people don't have the opportunity to spend a summer at the embassy in London or to run down the hallways of the State Department or Capitol Hill knowing people. But that's not what's important. What's important is learning how to cultivate relationships, how to get to know people. And everyone can start by simply working with those who you already know. For instance, do you know who your father's friends are? Do your father's friends know you? Mm-hmm. Where do your mother's friends work? What are their interests? And while it might seem quite mercenary at times, it's actually just a real life skill to get to understand people, who they are, where they're coming from. And then as an incidental benefit, when you then have an idea that you're interested in, I don't know, the Department of State, mm-hmm. You're able to say, wait a second, Mom, didn't your friend work at the Department of State? And of course, your mother is hopefully your friend also, and is going to say, well, sure, would you like me to put you in touch with them? And therein, your bona fides, your relationship, and your understanding of one person can translate into an extended understanding and relationship with others. In my case, in the Department of State, that's the heart of what diplomacy is using your own bona fides, relationships of trust and understanding of people to further the cause of your own nation.
Again, another great answer. I do have a follow-up.
Sure.
Let's say a student makes a connection, as I'm sure we all are eager to do, and we lose contact for a little bit. How does a student reach back? To just cold email, hi, how are you doing? Wanted to grab a coffee with you, or is there something more sophisticated?
That is totally acceptable. There is never any reason to apologize unless someone has been expecting something mm-hmm. from you and you have been remiss in following up on a responsibility. That rings a bit hollow. But if it's just the case that you haven't spoken with somebody for a few months, and then for some reason the relationship is called upon once again to be reignited. People are not going to be offended by the fact that we're all busy and sometimes can't administer the care and feeding to relationships that we would always like to do. I would add one thing to that. Be earnest. You're not doing things simply because you want a contact or simply because you want an in with somebody else. Hopefully, the reason why you're communicating with people is because you actually want to be part of their lives.
I'm going to move more into the structure of the Department of State.
Okay.
So can you talk a little bit about the, structure of how the workforce is divided up between civil service, foreign service, locally employed staff, and family members employed in the position overseas?
Sure, happy to do so. In many ways, the Department of State is kind of schizophrenic when you think about it, in that we have so many different pools of different people working to get the job done. There's about 75 to 80,000 people who get paid by the department on a regular basis. But interestingly enough, the vast majority of them are not Americans. They are the locally engaged staff at the embassies and consulates around the world. When you think about it, it makes sense. The plumber in Ethiopia, the driver in Japan, the protocol assistant in Canada, these are all people who have skills that are directly applicable to the operation, and we need them at all of these places around the world. They are not Americans, usually. There could be an American or two, but by and large, they're foreigners who have decided to cast their professional lot with the United States, either because they truly believe in what we're doing, or that's simply a good job to have in what might be a rather unstable economy. But either way, it's on their back that we work, and we are grateful for their contribution. But coming closer to home, there are about 30,000 Americans who work for the Department of State in equal-sized groups divided between the civil service and the foreign service. What I often say about the foreign service is we are the ones, I am in the foreign service, by the way, we are the ones who run around the world singing America's song wherever we can. But our civil service colleagues are the ones who are back here in the United States who are writing the sheet music. They're the ones who are the subject matter experts. They've decided to marry up their interest in foreign affairs and international relations with a more stable lifestyle. For whatever reason, whether it's the employment of a spouse or a child's educational needs, or simply personal preferences, they'd rather live and work and stay in one place and focus on one area of expertise for the duration of their careers. They're in the civil service. And the way in which they're employed with the Department of State is the same as it would be for any other civil servant in any other department of the U.S. government. They find a job that's advertised, usually on usajobs.gov. They apply for the job. They're selected for the job, they're cleared for the job, and then they start working. The Foreign Service, on the other hand, is a very different animal indeed. We're the ones, as I said, we live and work mostly overseas. And depending on the nature of the job for which we're hired, we're either tested for our ability to learn whatever we need to learn as Foreign Service generalists, or we are tested for our certifications and our pre-existing demonstrable skills, which we will work in for the remainder of our time as Foreign Service specialists.
You answered my next question talking about the implications of the profession. I'm going to move on and talk about what would you say the most important skill someone should have if they want a career in diplomacy, whether it is civil service or foreign service?
Well, there are many different skills that are required to work for the American government. I think for the Department of State specifically, what I would label as emotional intelligence, the ability to read the room, to understand what's going on around you, and to modify the way in which you communicate, possibly even the message that you're giving to the audience that you have in order to more effectively accomplish your goal. It may sound a bit mercenary, but it's not. It's simply the ability to not ruffle feathers when you don't need to, and when you do need to ruffle them, to do it in such a way that people are not offended and turn you off. A lot of it is the ability to establish and maintain relationships of trust. In addition to that, I think judgment and flexibility are necessary, particularly in a foreign affairs environment where the other side gets a say. Often it is the situation in government where people are acting on presupposed realities. The Department of Justice has the law. which it adheres to and it executes and enforces and makes sure that the law is served. But in the foreign affairs element, sometimes foreigners don't have the same laws or the same customs or the same traditions or languages or methods. And being able to incorporate that into the way that you work is very necessary.
Would you say for students watching, you recommend them studying abroad and getting experience
heavens, yes.
cultural differences?
I'd go a little bit further than that, because sometimes we conflate getting abroad with qualifying one for a cultural experience. And while that is certainly true, going overseas and doing things in different countries is a great thing. A similar cultural awakening can be had in your own hometown. Getting out of your own neighborhood, getting out of your own social environment. If you're a kid who's fortunate enough to have been raised in a rather regular American environment of plenty, get downtown and go work at a soup kitchen. Get to know the people around you whose lives are different than your own. That, in and of itself, is a wonderfully broadening experience.
I think what you just said is so great, because it comes back to this idea of, if you want to go into the State Department and serve, start from your hometown and serve.
Exactly.
Yeah, in your own community.
Well put.
What would you say the hiring process looks like for the State Department, specifically for people coming out of undergrad looking for entry-level positions?
It's always tough. It's supposed to be tough. If it were easy, everyone would do it. Washington is a big, messy, bureaucratic city filled with people who are churning. I mean, you drive on the roads up there, it's the same in the hallways. It's pushing, it's shoving, it's never personal, but it's always rush, 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 rush.
That sounds personal, right? Though.
Well, don't take it personal as I cut you off on the road, right?
Yeah.
But the reality is that everybody has to make their mark early in their career, whenever and however they're starting. You start at the bottom. If you're coming to what is not uncommon in Washington is that because the monolith of governmental employment is so daunting, and people fear it because, frankly, it's very almost counterintuitive, and you don't know how to manipulate it. This is one of the reasons why there are so many contractors in Washington, D.C., because it is not uncommon for recently graduated individuals to simply pack up the car, move to Washington, rent an apartment with 5 other people, and then just start hanging out their shingle. They'll go to contracting organizations. They'll say, "Hi, I want to work," and they'll say, "Fine. We'll give you this job and you get coffee at the Department of XYZ. And you start that way. You get to know people. Quite often, more often than not in Washington, D.C., the contracting firm will then get you a government clearance after 9 or 10 months. And you'll then have a greater tool and be of greater value to both that employer and others as you shop yourself around, ideally building those relationships, which I mentioned earlier, off of which you can then slowly have your own network of people on whom you can rely and who can rely on you.
Wow. That was, again, another great answer. Speaking more about internships and graduate fellowships, which ones are available and what kind of opportunities do they offer for students who want to, possibly skip the entry level debacle and struggle?
For the State Department specifically,
yes.
Correct? Okay. Let's clarify a bit of nomenclature that I think is rather peculiar to the department that can confuse people from the outside.
Okay.
When we use the word internship in the Department of State, we are largely speaking about undergraduates. Mm-hmm. While there are a few graduates who would qualify for internships, usually it's someone who hasn't yet gotten their bachelor's degree, who's looking for an internship. On the other hand, when we use the term fellowship, we're talking about graduate students. And we're talking about graduate students in a particular arrangement where they have been selected for a graduate fellowship, which, of course, is wonderful because tuition gets paid and there's a stipend involved. But then following on to that fellowship, there is an employment commitment, which comes hat in hand with it. so that those individuals who have taken advantage of such fellowships are then brought into the Department of State as employees, essentially paying off in time the investment the department has made. Now, that's a general overview on internships and fellowships. Now, going into a little bit greater depth, internships with the Department of State are conducted every academic semester. We mirror the American university system. So there's always going to be a cohort of interns who are coming in either September, January, or May. Now, within those cohorts, you can start early, mid, or late because schools have different schedules. But keep in mind that we are always conducting internships. Applications for those internships are a little bit problematic because we need all of our interns to have top secret clearances, and those don't come easy or quickly. And so what we have to do is, if we are looking to staff internships in September, we're probably going to advertise them in January. And so undergrads have to actually plan a little bit more than one day ahead of things.
Yeah.
They have to think, am I going to be able to do that internship a semester and a half or 2 semesters away? So it involves a lot of pre-planning and thought. That being said, I would recommend that every undergraduate watching this video consider applying for a State Department internship every semester of their undergraduate academic career. The simple reason is there's no downside risk.
Yeah.
Once you have put the package together, all you have to do is resubmit it each time. And given the volume of people who are applying for our internships, while I don't want to say that it is a spin of the wheel, it's just when there are so many people applying, it's very hard to make yourself look much different than all of the other excellent people who are looking for it. So you increase your chances by the frequency of your application rather than simply by the relative quality of your application. Simply put, vote early and vote often, right?
Yeah. So I actually want to talk about this because I was lucky enough to do the internship at the State Department.
Yes.
And a lot of times I tell my friends or fellow VCU students that apply as often as you can, but also keep in mind that you want to make yourself, available to them with the language that works for the State Department. So I'll give you an example. I would love to know your thoughts about it. When I'm writing my applications, I try to focus on the future and talking about how my personal experiences in my education can feed into the future that I want to build through the State Department. Would you agree with that? Is that something that a student should?
100%. You've just encapsulated the core of a good application for an internship. Though I have not reviewed those, and I usually would not because I am more on the recruitment side, I am going to tell you with an absolute certainty that enthusiasm for the work of the Department of State and the planned way in which an applicant would apply the knowledge and experience learned during the internship are critical components to the successful applicant.
Yeah. I think what's also really important as students to keep in mind is that a no or a rejection does not mean failure. It just means that it's an experience and it's knowledge for the next time that you're applying. So it's nothing wrong with you. It's just what you need to work on in the future to be more ready for this position.
So embracing the favor or the failure of it all.
Embracing it and not taking it personally. I think when I first started, I would take a lot of rejections personally. Like, why would they not want me? And it's not about that. It's about maybe I'm not ready yet. Maybe I need to do a little bit more work to make them ready for me and accept me.
And I would add to that, sometimes it's not even about that. It's that of the candidates at that specific time, you weren't the optimal one. But that doesn't mean of the candidates the next time, you won't be the optimal one.
Yeah. And sometimes being the optimal one can just mean that you don't have the required skills to do what they want you to do. And imagine being there and people expecting you to do something that you can't do. So it's not optimal anyway. I wanted to ask you about the Foreign Service officer testing.
Okay.
Sounds really scary just saying.
Oh, yeah.
Saying it
Intimidating.
out loud. What is the assessment process like? Can you talk a little bit about the timeline and the method behind it?
Sure. Happy to do so.
Thank you.
The Foreign Service Officer Test and the Foreign Service Officer Assessment are two steps in a long process that we use to select the next generation of American diplomats. The test is held every year 3 times, in February, in June, and in October. Registration for the test opens up 8 weeks prior to the examination itself. As you can imagine, people usually jump on and register as quickly as they possibly can, and it can be that times, dates, and even the capacity of the system to handle all of the applicants will fill up. So it's important that individuals register early and make sure that they can secure a seat in any given exam that they want to take. The way an individual does that is they would usually want to register with the Department of State's Talent Network. You do this by going to www.careers.state.gov, and you can follow the prompts to request notification of the opening of the Foreign Service test registration window. Frankly, you can do that to also register interest in any of the other many positions that are available, not just in the Foreign Service, but in the entire Department of State's organization. So once you have successfully registered for the Foreign Service exam, which process is very similar to applying for university, in that you answer a lot of questions, we give you a few prompts to which you need to write some narratives, and you need to select the career track of interest that you want to be considered for in the Department of State. You will then be allowed to schedule the time, date, and location of your test. If you pass the Foreign Service Officer test, you will be invited to the Foreign Service Officer Assessment. This is a much broader and deeper process, which takes 2 days in 3 separate sessions, wherein your thinking, your communication, your ability to respond, your ability to work well with others are all tested and considered before a final decision is made as to your candidacy. If you pass the assessment, then you're given the necessary security and medical documentation necessary to process in order to determine whether you are security and medically fit for such a job. Once those determinations are positively made, then your entire candidacy is reviewed one last time for suitability. And assuming no derogatory information is available, you are then placed on a register from which the department will draw invitations out for people to start in the Foreign Service. If after 18 months on the register, your candidacy does not receive an invitation, your candidacy is terminated, and you must start the process all over again. Now, as somebody who's done that a few different times, I can assure you every step is worth it.
Finishing up the interview, I want to ask some more fun questions.
Sure.
What is one unforgettable experience that you have had through your career?
Wow, that's a challenge. I think
They're all so boring.
they're all so boring, right? Yes. I think the one memorable experience that I have, oddly enough, was on an island in the Pacific called Ponape in the Federated States of Micronesia, where one of my colleagues and his wife were expecting a baby. We were literally thousands of miles away from the nearest hospital. And unfortunately, at about 6 months along, she suddenly went into labor with an extremely premature child, thousands of miles away from anywhere that could assure that that child would successfully make it through their first days of life. She delivered the baby boy. He weighed less than 3 pounds. And we were in a very, very deprived medical setting. we got together with the nursing students at a local nursing school, all young kids between 16 and 18 years old. And we determined that the only way that this baby could live would be if all of them helped out and took turns breathing for the baby as we worked frantically to get a life flight evacuation. They agreed to do it.
Wow.
And those little those little breaths that these students were taking every time, and with a modicum of medical instruction, but the heart of gold that they would do anything to try to save their patient. For days, they worked with that baby, just a very small little baby, American diplomat's baby, and they were willing to help. Finally, we were able to get a life flight all the way from Australia, which was the closest place. And as we all stood there on the tarmac, and watched the plane and the parents and the baby fly away, there was a tremendous gratification that when things are at their worst, people are at their best. And that was the case on that little island. You can imagine the joy 6 months later when they brought that baby home. Oh. And I had the good fortune about 15 years later in my career to actually have that little boy show up as a snotty little high school student at another embassy to bother me. And it was a true joy to see that happen.
That sounds amazing.
It was really rewarding.
Thank you so much for sharing that
Sure.
story. To finish off the interview, I want to talk about books that you recommend students pick up. It can be fiction, nonfiction. I know more reading outside of class. We can do it though. That you recommend students pick up to get ready for, what's ahead of them, either in public service or what you think they should keep in mind.
I think the most useful book for someone who's interested in this career is something that the American Foreign Service Association put together and continues to update on a regular basis. It is, fortunately, titled Inside a U.S. Embassy, and it's a compendium of nothing but stories from dozens and dozens of people from every conceivable different job in the Foreign Service, trying to express what their lives are like, what their experiences are, what they do for a living, their challenges, their satisfaction, their rewards. From what I've been able to see, it is the best compendium for someone who really wants to get an idea of what it would be like to be a diplomat for the United States.
Well, I wrote it down. I'm gonna
Inside a U.S. Embassy.
Got it. Well, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope this was helpful for VCU students or any students that go on the VCU webpage. Thank you again.
Oh, thank you, Renuka. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.
Thanks.